and the revenue mobilization for structural transformation. This is a report prepared by ECA every 2 years, and it has dealt with issues of political governance before, economic governance, corporate governance. And I am pleased to have with, and I am pleased and we are also grateful to Mr. Julius Gatoni Karuki, Senior Policy Analyst at SET, who will moderate this launch. And we are also grateful to discussants, the discussants who joined us from outside of Ethiopia and from Ethiopia here. We will have Ms. Beyonce Gowanus, United Nations Under Secretary General. Sorry, we don't have USG. She's not here. She's next to you. Madam, I'm sorry, madam. Okay. Madam Beyonce Gowanus, United Nations Secretary General and Special Advisor on Africa. Kojo Busia, Economic Affairs Officer, ECA. Professor Annette Ugoto, University of South Africa, she's here. And Ambassador Bankole Adio, Nigerian Ambassador to Ethiopia and to AU ECA. Without further ado, let me give the floor to the moderator, Julius Laruke. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Welcome again for this session. We will have now, and then we will have a presentation, and then we'll have a panel discussion, and thereafter we will have a question and answer session. Therefore, I think we have already done the openings here, remarks. Or you, no. We want to do the opening remark right now. Yes, this will be done by Mr. Abdallah Hamdok, Deputy Executive Secretary and Chief Economist at ECA, Economic Commission of Africa. Welcome.
Thank you very much, moderator. Good afternoon, friends and colleagues. Let me first start by welcoming two of friends and colleagues. We have been acquainted with them for years. Beyonce, welcome home. Addis is missing you definitely. And we are delighted to see you back in Ethiopia. I would also like to welcome my dear brother Bankole, Excellency Ambassador of Nigeria to Ethiopia, AU and ECA, Professor Annette Ugoto, University of South Africa, Adam and Kojo, our colleagues. All protocol formalities are observed. It's really an honor and a great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon on the inaugural launch of the 5th edition of the African Governance Report. The AGR is a flagship publication of the UNECA. This is its 5th session. We are very proud that the previous 4 reports has managed to address a number of very important and pertinent issues on governance in the continent. I remember vividly one of the previous reports on elections and management of diversity in Africa has really made it to the being able to put on the agenda of the continent such an important, challenging issue of elections. People might have asked themselves then why an economic commission is talking about elections. But you know very well 40 years ago, or probably even 30, 20 years ago, governance has been seen as externally driven by Bretton Woods institutions. It's an external agenda. But Africa's own experience told us that you can get your macro right, sectoral policy right, but until you get your governance right, nothing moves. That is why the revival or the recognition of governance as a key issue in the development agenda of this continent. And I think ECA, in recognizing that, has embarked on this journey probably close to 20 years ago in addressing issues of governance, and hence the series of AGRs. This current one on the theme natural resource governance and domestic resource mobilization for structural transformation in Africa essentially builds on the previous reports, but also expected, and you will see the report, to address this important issue of natural resource. Africa is a very rich continent, yet very poor. We have, you know the statistics, longest maybe rivers in the world, Nile, Congo, Niger, rich in many other resources, minerals, name it, forest, all kind of natural resources. But and you know the statistics also, natural resource had dominated economic activity in the continent. Minerals, for example, accounting for an average of 70% of total African exports, about 28% of gross domestic product, GDP. It's a huge amount of resources. The paradox is these resources are exploited still in the old-fashioned model of Africa continued to export raw materials. There is very little value addition in this sector, which is very sad. Not only that, I think the model that prevailed in the continent today is the model where the exploitation of natural resources is taking place in parallel to the rest of the economy or the development agenda of the country. There is very little interaction between this sector and the rest of the economy. Typically, you would find a mine at a throw stone from a village that has no water, no electricity, and no roads. This model of dig and export has to stop. We need to add value to our export, to our minerals, to our natural resources, in the interest of the development and transformation of the continent. This very serious issue of addressing the development finance of the continent require us to add value to our commodities, but also get those precious resources and foreign currencies to fund our development. I think in the present development, you will be able to follow, you will be able to resource based Ferris, very important awareness on the status of linkages between organization, development planning, and domestic funding, and second, enhance understanding and appreciation of options and opportunities to proactively leverage the natural or structure as an engine for the mission of our continent. I hope the report will assist the process of policy making and policy announcement and policy regularly by our senior policy makers, particularly being launched at this annual meeting of the African Ministers of Finance, Planning, and Economic Development. And I think our ministers and senior policy makers from the continent will be able to have copies of this report, maybe can assist in addressing these challenges. And let's stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hamdok, for that. I call now for the formal presentation of this report. This will be done by formal presentation of this report. Macroeconomic Policy Division, Economic Commission for Africa. Macroeconomic Policy Division, Economic Commission.
Mr. Chair, once again, because I will try to be very brief in the presentation. The 5th edition of African Governance Report is on natural resource governance and domestic revenue mobilization for structural transformation of Africa. And the key messages of the report, and do we have the report, the PowerPoint presentation? Okay, I will continue. When Africa has been slow to convert its natural resource endowments to tangible development outcomes. Two good natural resources than development on the continent. So the key issues we try to study in this report are one, the issue of structural dependence on primary commodity exports, dependence on commodity exports on the continent, and then the demand and price volatility of these commodities and how they impact investment and investment. the institutional framework for natural resource governance, and we look at the issue of development plans, comprehensive and integrated development plans in the sector for the use of natural resources, resource management strategies, resource management collected data, including Botswana, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Egypt, Madagascar, Nigeria, Uganda, and Tanzania. And we looked at these countries to highlight diversity in natural resource governance and outcomes. The structure of the report, which would be circulated, which will be disseminated soon, is as follows. We have 6 chapters. Chapter 1 is on analytical framework, articulation of the problem and the issues to be discussed. And chapter 2 is on institutional and regulatory frameworks. Chapter 3 on renewing resource-based development planning. And chapter 4 on mobilizing domestic revenue. Chapter 5 on natural resource governance experiences in the 8 case study countries. And finally, chapter 6 tries to articulate a natural resource governance policy framework for African countries, a framework that countries can use to analyze their own policy frameworks. The key issues examined include issues relating to the ability of resource-rich African countries to transform their economies, challenges of establishing institutions for improving the development impact of natural resources in Africa, and the issues of the interface between development planning and policy outcomes, and challenging of raising domestic revenue in Africa. So this is the context and the framework we started with. The key findings, very briefly, are as follows. Probably this is not, of course, something new, but there is a documentation of this fact. There is impressive growth in the selected countries and in Africa as a whole in the last 2 decades, but the transformation remains very limited. And the graph here shows growth in Africa as a whole, growth in resource-rich countries, and growth in resource-poor countries. And the question that comes to mind all the time is why resource-poor countries seem to grow overall at a higher rate than resource-rich countries. And they do better even in terms of progress towards transformation and diversification. So, what rich countries do, rich countries do, resource the rest of the economy. Rich countries resources in terms of location of the sources And there is a need to institutions that work on regulation and licensing, revenue collection and management, and legislative and judiciary arrangements that are needed for countries to improve management and utilization of natural resource revenue. In this respect, in the report, we analyze the various initiatives that were adopted by many African countries, including the natural resource chapter, the extract natural resource chapter, the active industry transfer to inactive, doing better. Botswana is a really integrate use of plants in the development plans. The the role as a plant as use of natural resources and use of natural resources indicate that in terms of that in terms of raising domestic revenue, especially from natural domestic revenue, of the factors mentioned, commodity price fluctuations of the factors mentioned, price fluctuation, stabilize. Revenue over the last 10-15 years. Significant increases have been noted, and of course, as we have seen through the discussion on SDGs and Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Action Agenda implement as a key instrument to implement the SDGs in Africa, it has been well articulated that Africa has to increasingly rely on domestic resources to finance its development. And this trend of increasing non-resource revenue in Africa is a positive trend that should be encouraged. But resource revenue should also be better managed in this context. The findings, again, Chapter 5, show different approaches to natural resource governance and natural resource impact in the 8 case study countries. And Again, in the 8 countries, there was notable GDP growth, but unemployment remained high in the selected resource-rich countries. And in resource-rich countries in particular, we have noted significant vulnerability due to external shocks. 7 out of the 8 countries show relatively low levels of domestic resource mobilization compared to Africa's average, and there are many gaps in natural resource planning and utilization of natural revenue. So the figure here shows the trend of domestic revenue mobilization in the 8 selected countries: Botswana, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Egypt, Madagascar, Nigeria, Tanzania, and Uganda. The trend seems to be, well, the graph does not really help us to show the variations, but there are variations over time, but there are significant variations, as you can see here, across countries because of their resource endowments and efforts by governments to use natural resource exports to enhance domestic resources. To conclude, Mr. Chairman, the report indicates the need to strengthen institutional and regulatory frameworks and to enhance transparency and accountability in economic governance, and to prioritize resource-based development planning and accelerate diversification and expanding links for structural transformation through value addition. And in this regard, we make reference, of course, to the various studies prepared by ECA previously on commodity-based industrialization and value addition, and we need to strengthen domestic revenue mobilization, improve resource sharing mechanism. And this regard, development plans need to be inclusive, and private sector has to be part and parcel of the process of development planning and utilization of resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting and presentation, and I think quite insightful. I think resource gas is still a challenge, apparently, and we still have to think how to work on it and what policy that are required. And I think there are some recommendations there. But I think what we really need is to have some few people reflect on what this is all. What do we need to, how do we need to think about this? How can we go ahead and tame this resource curse, which seems to have been around for quite some time, and connect it to longer development planning. I think for this we'll have a panel of experts who will give their reflections on this, and I think we'll have about 8 minutes. We don't have much time. Let's have 8 minutes each for people to reflect, and then five maybe, please. Okay, let's have 5 so that we have at least more questions from the floor. So we have 4 panelists. We have Benis Governors from United Nations Under Secretary General and Special Advisor. We have also Kofi Busia from AMDC, Kojo Busia from AMDC, Africa Mineral Development Commission. We also have Professor Annette Ogutu, as I mentioned, from Annette Ogutu from University of South Africa, and also Ambassador Bankole sitting next to me. So we'll start with the first panelist to give a reflection. This is Ms. Benis Governors. Please, I hope I've got your name right. Intervention, 5 minutes, and then go ahead.
Thank you very much, moderator. Thank you, my brother, Namdok, for inviting me to be on this panel. I am not going to call myself an expert. I think I will bring in just a perspective on speaking to the findings, basically. You know, I prepared something, but I think in the minutes that I have, I would rather flag some some of the issues. I think I want to congratulate ECA for coming up with this report, which is very timely. It is timely on 3 counts. Timely because the Secretary General has been talking since he assumed office that his emphasis is going to be on prevention rather than managing conflicts. And once we understand what he says, we will go further and say, we know now what are the causes of conflict on the continent. It has got to do with the same natural resources that we are talking about. The air that we breathe, the land that we live on, what is under the land, what is in the sea. And it is also an issue where we have said, and it is always the paradox of our continent, that we are rich yet poor. That our people live next to the richest and yet are the poorest. They live next to the oil, next to the minerals, next to the water where we have the fish. Very few eat that fish. Very few eat from that mineral resources. And therefore, the timeliness of this report that says that the natural resources, if I put it in very simple terms, should not just increase the GDP, but should increase the lives of our people. It should translate itself in a better living standard of our people, because it's only by improving the living standards of our people, by increasing development in our countries, that we can prevent conflicts. So that's why I'm saying this report is very timely in view of orientation that we are moving to within the UN. Secondly, we talked about, even just 2 days ago, we talked about 2 things: the illicit financial flows, and we talked about corruption. All the more reason why we need effective governance of our natural resources, because it's within that milieu that we see when we talk about illicit financial flows, where our money is coming from and where it goes. So let us link, when we talk about natural resource governance, that we are talking about transparency, about accountability. In fact, was it yesterday that the colleague from is it the national, UNEP? Is it UNEP? Ne? Where he also talked about issues such as conflicts, and talked about, and I can see trucks loads of timber moved across borders in Africa. Trucks loads of timber. Now, you don't know whether this timber is exported in the right way, and whether there had been environmental studies conducted to see whether by logging the timber that we are left with further certification of our soil. So what I am trying to do by my intervention is merely to first say that this report is very timely, but that it needs to be looked at in also the broader context of the issues that that were raised, especially during this time. And I think yesterday I was one of those that said, although the discussion was on illicit financial flows, that I said if we finally manage to close that gap and we have got the savings, that savings be ring-fenced for development. And so linking it to what we are discussing now is that if we have proper governance of our natural resources and we are using that resources towards development, that is basically what we are talking about. So I will not go back to my statement. I think I mentioned, some of it, but I cannot leave without saying that when we are discussing this issue of development, unemployment, let us look at whom are we seeing that should ultimately be the beneficiaries of development in Africa. These are the women, the vulnerable, the marginalized populations that we have on our continent. Ultimately, it's not about economic growth. It's about social justice. It's about social cohesion. And it's about social inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll go to our next speaker, Kojo Busia. And I think, interesting, I've worked with him before, and I know AMDC has been working a lot on the issue of enclave economies, because we have been told mines tend to be enclave economies, not linked to local economies, not giving anybody jobs. Please, give your intervention.
Thank you, Julius. DS, USG, Gowanus. It's a real opportunity for the African Mineral Development Center to comment on this report, the African Governance Report 5, which seeks to locate the debate on natural resource governance in Africa within the context of structural transformation of Africa's economies. In fact, it seeks, if I could say, to endorse years ago, and which the African Mineral Development Center has been mandated to implement. The nature of African mineral economies, which is characterized as an enclaved economy, which the DES also referred to, came about as a result of a colonial mode of extraction, which continues even up to today. And the whole effort to reverse this colonial enclave economy, which is removed from the rest of the economy, seems to me to be the main overriding thesis of this report. And of course, linked to that is the institutional framework, which must be reversed to be able to broaden the economy and transform it so that we could broaden the tax base to mobilize more domestic resources for structural transformation. We all know that the colonial mode of extractives of our natural resource, first of all, the mineral rights were owned by foreigners outside the local economy. So naturally, the extraction of raw materials exported outside the local economy. But the only benefit that the state could perhaps get was through taxation. There was no systematic way or any strategy to use natural resource to industrialize the local economy. And of course, even the infrastructure that was invested in extraction of the economy were all externally oriented. A typical mineral-dependent economy you will find in Africa would have a road from the mine to the port just to facilitate the transportation of the raw material. So naturally, that structure itself fundamentally flaws the attempt to be able to change it. It's a major challenge in itself. And of course, associated with this are the institutions themselves that were spawned by this colonial mode of extraction. Those institutions were elite-based. If you take the colonial state itself as elite that is removed from the local population, but also it was non-transparent, it was non-accountable, and it was non-participatory. So what we have taken for granted as resource curse is really not a natural order or natural state of affairs. It is not ordained by God that if you have natural resources, you are condemned to be cursed and that you cannot develop it. In fact, it is particularly developed by this historical condition. So the resource curse, therefore, is not unique and can't be transformed. It is just characterized by a political economy of resource-dependent economies, as I said, which is characterized by this enclave nature of the economy. And we know that the resource curse has several dimensions. The economic dimension is poor revenue predictability due to, of course, the external market of the commodity itself. the volatility of price of those commodities that make it difficult for countries to plan and to predict revenue streams. And of course, the attendant overvalued exchange rate, which usually makes it difficult for other sectors of the economy through the domestic exchange rate, or if you like, making exports more expensive and so on. And the political dimension is even more challenging because you have a state that depends solely on revenue from one particular sector, this mono economy, if you like, without mobilizing resources from citizens. Therefore, there is no broader tax base where the state can mobilize revenue and solely depend on this particular commodity. And the implications of that is that the state will only be accountable to the company or the firm that does the extraction, but not to the larger population, because it does not raise revenue through income taxation and otherwise. So you have a state that is not accountable to citizens simply because it does not mobilize resources from those citizens. And of course, associated with that is the rent-seeking phenomenon of the local elite, which sometimes translates into corruption. And of course, the attendant political fallout among elites for competition to access this natural resource, which then, of course, lead to political conflict and eventually state collapse. So the point is the natural resource curse can be reversed. It was created by a particular mode of production by the colonial state, inherited by the post-colonial state, which has made it very difficult to structurally disenclave the resource economy from what it used to be. So then comes the African Mining Vision, which this report endorses almost fully in terms of the paradigmatic shift from an enclave economy to a much more integrated, linking the resource sector to the broader economy so that you be able to broaden the tax base and create more linkages and create more industries, both upstream, downstream, side stream, and spatial stream, all of which are meant to structurally transform the economy of a resource base of country. So the report vehemently, I think, endorses the African Mining Vision. It seeks to put it in the governance realm and context and actually propose a development planning agenda which is based on using the natural resource endowments, systematically linking it to other sectors of the economy, which will then broaden the tax base, make it the state able to provide public goods, be able to provide services to citizens, legitimize the state itself, and make mineral resource governance a sustainable outcome. One of the areas of linkages which I think the report broaches but could go deeper, and which the African Mineral Development Center is working on, is the upstream aspect of the mining sector development. In other words, in a typical mining or oil sector investment, there are several opportunities which our state can use to be able to leverage this resource through contract negotiation, whereby through policies of local content, whereby having more local enterprises participate in the supply chain that feeds into the development of the particular investment, whether it's a mine or oil, therefore creating enough economic activity around the mines. The whole issue of infrastructure leveraging, whereby instead of having the colonial infrastructure from port to the mine, we are now saying, can we link the infrastructure to agriculture production in the country, leveraging the resource so that we can spatially integrate the mining to the broader economy, and so on and so on. So basically, to conclude, the contribution of this report is fundamental. It seeks to reverse the structural enclave nature of our mineral-dependent economy simply by using linkages and diversification strategies, which would then broaden the tax base, enhancing state accountability to citizens, because taxes will be derived from citizens and not from this one particular economy, which is externally oriented. In other words, state being accountable to the mining firm and not to the population at large. And therefore, it answers the question of how do we domestically mobilize resources, so that if you diversify the economy, if you diversify the tax base, the government will be able to mobilize more resources. Even the phenomenon of illicit financial flow, whereby most of it occurs in the extractive sector, comes about because of this enclave nature of the mineral economy. If we are able to have more local enterprises being the suppliers to the mining company, most of the illicit leakages in the mining sector occurs because mining companies overvalue their imports that goes into the mining operations. No opportunity for the mining company to use over-invoicing and overpricing, which reduces the corporate taxes, reduces the revenue stream to the government. So it is a very simple link between domestic resource mobilization, structurally transforming the economy, using the mining or the natural resource endowments to leverage the economy. And that will optimally make our state sustainable and manage our mineral resources in an equitable, fair, and transparent way. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Kojo, that very interesting intervention. Kojo, that very interesting. Yes, resource scarcity is not Africa to make a
the launch of the important report but has brought the economic, political, and social economic circumstances, and are able to understand this. If comment that for African countries, and as one of those that came in, we worked so hard on the report. I thank so much the core team that worked on the report, the likes of Eunice Jambo, George Karachi, Susan Karunji, Francis Ikomi, Habib Ben Barak. Thank you so much for such a wonderful report that you have come up with. Now, the review process is quite rigorous. They draft the initial report, they call this expert group, we literally tear it apart, and that should give you satisfaction that we have actually come out with a report that we are happy with. We go through chapter by chapter, they present, thank you for the thick skin that you developed, we literally comment, we criticize this, that, and this, and then we retain that relationship with them whereby, you know, they can come back to us and we contribute here and we contribute even up to the final development of the report. I must report that I am very happy with how the report looks like, especially on and one of the issues that I was very, very about, and it is one of the vexing issues that we are dealing with when it comes to the extractive industry. I've just returned from the IBFT African Tax Symposium that took place in Mombasa, and we're still dealing with these very same issues, especially when it comes to petroleum. One of the pertinent issues comes with the way with the lack of transparency, participation, accountability, and synergy between the different public bodies that deal with the extractives. And this matter is dealt with in the report. You check your pages 108 and 117, very well drafted. And one of the concerns here is the lack of coordination between industries. If you look at, for example, the signing of agreements that deal with extractives usually are dealt with the ministries of finance of the different countries, and usually when they sign these agreements, they'll give tax exemptions and all sorts of beautiful things will be promised to these investors. So if you look at, for example, the famous Ugandan case, Heritage Oil, that the report refers to on page 45, and I'm very happy about that, is that Uganda actually won the case on the tax treaty perspective. And since the investor was not happy with that and there was no arbitration provision in the double tax treaty, they decided to do what we call treaty shopping and made use of the arbitration provision in the bilateral investment agreement that was signed with the Ministry of Investment. And that is how they managed to take the case for arbitration in London. And of course, fortunately, Uganda won the case. But this is a concern that is going on, issues regarding arbitration provisions and how investors are able to play about with the different regulatory environments that we have that are not coordinated between the different institutions that deal with the mining. The investment, the ministries of investment promise the investors this, and yet the income taxes and the constitution say a different thing altogether. And then when the two elephants begin to fight, then that is when they realize that the Ministry of Finance and the Revenue Authority should have been contacted when this type of investment agreements are entered into. So this is well presented in the report, and I am very happy about it. Another matter that is of great importance, as Mr. Busia Kojo has just explained, is the issue concerning illicit financial flows and how this impact, especially in the extractive sector in the African setting. The trade mispricing and trade misinvoicing is such a major concern, and it is dealt with in the report. In conjunction with this, of course, there are issues regarding tax avoidance, the transfer pricing that is also a major culprit when it comes to, avoiding taxes that relate to extractives. Then another important thing they deal with somewhere, I think in page 20 of the report, is the tax incentives coupled with the arbitration provisions I've just talked about. The tax incentives that we offer as African countries to it's almost the same investors that are investing in all these countries, and yet we are offering them different incentives. And this drives what we call the race to the bottom, as each country is racing down to giving the lowest possible incentives. And finally, you find that all countries in the region do not benefit from the tax incentives that they offer, and this impacts on domestic revenue mobilization in Africa. So there is need for harmonization of our laws and how we deal with the same very investors that invest in this country. The report commends or refers to the work of the African Mining Vision Action Plan, and this is commendable. And I trust that the issues that, I'm happy that the issues that we raised as an expert group, at least those that I was very passionate about, appear in the report, especially with respect to the regulatory framework and the institutional frameworks pertaining to extractives. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'll now call upon Ambassador to give intervention, and hopefully we can hear more about the political, how to deal with the political issues. Ambassador Bankole Adeoye, Nigeria Ambassador to Ethiopia, please welcome and for your intervention.
Thank you very much, moderator. Thank you very much, Deputy Executive Secretary, colleagues. It's always good to speak last from the panel. Everybody has said everything, so I will just give you a totally different perspective. The first is that we all agree that Africa's landscape is changing. Good governance has become a value that we all share. However, we are deficient in seeing good governance in sectoral matters, particularly socio-economic. Therefore, there is so much emphasis on the political, the elections, democracy, democratization, to the detriment of the sectors that will actually deliver what people call democracy dividends. So I think it is one area where the report is now being a very good, provides a very good platform to show that there is a need for us to see governance in its totality. The Undersecretary General also mentioned the vulnerabilities and the growth which the report already identifies. So I will not dwell too much into that. But the main factor, the first point I would like to make, is that good governance is a development factor. The Deputy Executive Secretary mentioned that, and I think this report identifies that. But my main point that I would like to make is that there is an illusion of some natural resource richness. I believe it's a very grand illusion that we must address. Indeed, there is no such thing as resource-rich countries. For example, in Nigeria, where I come from, the total budget, the total income from crude oil exports at the time in the early 2000 was equivalent to the total budget of the fire department of New York City. So what's rich in that? We are endowed, yes. And just before this meeting, I checked the dictionary word for endowment. There's no richness as synonym. It is a blessing, it is a favor, it's an investment. Until we make natural resources work for us, then we can say we are rich. But if, as everybody on this panel has said today, we continue to do the dig and just export, as Kojo said, we are not going to be considered rich. I think it's one factor that we must look at, and it is important for us to continue to see it as an enabler for some countries to be able to do better. Then the political economy, that's my third point, of natural resource governance and management is something that the report actually dwells on. And I recall that in those days in the University of Lagos, we had a professor who tried to teach us political economy. And the first thing he said is that Africa's problem is that Africa consumes what it does not produce and produces what it does not consume. It is exactly the challenge of natural resource governance. And we can say this all throughout, and that is why the report has dwelled very well on the demand and price volatility and how this complicates government revenue. And indeed, the whole budgeting cycle, which the Undersecretary General also mentioned. The boom and the bust are all related to that political economy that we are not addressing. So we are still in the colonial stage, which Kojo really emphasized. My fourth point is we really need to dwell on the institutional effectiveness. We know that policy coherence, policy coordination, indeed Nigeria's Economic Recovery and Growth Plan 2017-2020 refers to us dealing with the subnational. I'm not sure how deep the report went into the subnational components and stakeholders. We need to do more in terms of institutional development, not just at the stage of the national. We are progressing, we are really making progress, talking of capable states, states that have legitimacy. And I'm happy that the report really mentions this. And this is a challenge in certain countries. And as you know, in Nigeria, the popular phrase was resource control. We need to control our resources, control the revenue, control the management, therefore meaning they need to build the institutions. So one of the things the government did was to set up to design a master plan for the Niger Delta. And for the only part of Nigeria where you have a ministry for the Niger Delta affairs, just to make sure that it deals with it. But there's always a tendency for us to think that institutions are created to solve a solution. But I think we need to go beyond that so that we can make our institutions actually accountable, transparent, and all these are in the report. But I think one word we are missing in the report is that the institutions must be resilient. They must be resilient to be able to deal with all this, and of course, deal less with political influence. My time is going up because I have a stopwatch here, but I'll quickly just go right to the issues that relate to the development planning. Is imperative. We all said that. It is very critical. I wonder why, and I think the ECA should address this, why multinationals that invest in our economies in Africa do not go on the capital market. Why do they not go on the capital market? They come from their countries. They are on their market on New York Stock Exchange and London Stock Exchange, but when they invest in Africa, it's totally secret. People are not buying into there's no IPOs and all that. That is a factor. And then we see natural resource. We have been talking a lot about minerals and all that. How about the natural resource that Africa has always been known with? The food, and then the food security that we also need to emphasize. So I think these are posers, and I think we need to look at commodities exchange in that part. Finally, going mainly, I agree fully with the domestic revenue efforts, emphasis of the report. It is very critical for us to continue to see it as an avenue to raise more resources for government. But it should go beyond natural resource. Some countries are doing well without much natural resource, and we must continue to go and think beyond aid, which is one factor. But we can also use aid to focus on developing the revenue that is really necessary and putting it where it is very, very critical. Finally, I think the report mentions to an extent partnerships, but I would say we should go smart partnerships. If we have the smart partnership with the private sector, if we develop the nexus between financing for development, capacity development, and South-South cooperation, there's a tendency for us not to learn from the best. And I tell you, development is contagious. It is contagious. We can see what happened from Japan to China to the new industrializing countries in Southeast Asia. We need to bring that back to Africa, and we need to see the necessity to have that, the centrality of national ownership, but also leadership. When people lead their own programs and processes, they will do better. Finally, I really want to refer to the study we did in May 2013 with ECA when I was in NEPAD, and that report was around domestic resource mobilization. And I think the most important thing that report said is that Africa needs to look purposely and decisively within itself. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I wonder how many. This is a question and answer session. I really want to direct. How many minutes do we give for that? Because we know you have 10 minutes, 15 minutes, two minutes per person. But how many people do we encourage? We want questions from the floor, but I'm a bit worried. But anyway, let's go ahead and have you raise your question. And try to actually make it quite short, and maybe not a speech. Just try to, and if you can, maybe you can direct to one person if you're really asking a question. And also, please make it short. Thank you. So can I raise your hands, please? We'll take 3 questions, then 3 questions. Comments, yeah. I also welcome. Yeah. We have one there. Go ahead.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. This is the ambassador from Benin. I'm very glad to be part of this launch. We have heard this very good information on the governance of natural resources on the continent. We would like to congratulate all the speakers who have given us more, who have shed more light on this issue of the governance of natural resources. I have a concern on one of the issues that Mrs. Ogutu mentioned. she did mention that investors take advantage of loopholes in the contracts for managing or exploitation of natural resources. Would she please shed some more light on these weaknesses of this or loopholes in these contracts? Thank you.
Repeat the. Okay. She was not here getting the question because she was not on the. Maybe you can just quickly repeat the question to her.
Wait.
Yes, certainly. The legal framework that governs exploitation of natural resources has apparently some loopholes. This is to say that the contracts that are signed by investors in this sector have some weaknesses, and Madam Ogutu, Professor Annette Ogutu, did mention this issue, and we would like to have some more clarification on these loopholes or weaknesses that lead to the loss of interests by African states in the management and exploitation of their natural resources. Thank you.
Do you have another question? We can take 3 then get answers. Is there any other comment question? Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'll first of all want to thank the presenter, panelists, and of course the Deputy Executive Secretary for a very clear presentation and introduction that they've given concerning this African Governance Report 5. But I have a question for anyone who, especially I guess the professor who said she was part of the composers of this document. Is there anywhere in this document that says, because of course I heard Mr. Kojo talk about the course, or the unique course, you know, that natural resources had in the past and up until now provided to African countries, you know. So is there anywhere in this document that refers to or give an example of any country in Africa that has successfully, you know, up until today, been able to use its natural resources, or like the ambassador said, the natural resources endowments, you know, which Africa has? Is there any country so far in Africa that has been able to use it to translate, you know, the better livelihood of the African people, and has been able to, you know, improve the government of its country? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there any other? Just one more. Okay, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. The report is a very good one, and I have just one maybe important point to make in relation to taking it forward. Particularly, I'm aware of the various activities and publications and works in related areas within the ECA. So one of the points that I would like to highlight is that we can undertake, especially in future exercises such as the Economic Report on Africa, analytical work on share of royalties and data allocation between federal governments and local governments. As far as we are dealing with SDG targets, inclusive growth, and also benefits of our natural resources to households at a micro level, I think analytically we should do some work on the allocation, the fiscal allocation of non-tax revenues coming from royalties, and how that is played out between federal governments and local governments. I think the boxes within the report have highlighted this, but that can be corroborated further by doing more exercise work, linking it to future publications of the Commission. I think that is very strategic, and it is the best way going forward, in my view.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we'll just have a quick response and have another round. I think the first question was for Professor Annette. I think the second one was more to Adam, I think, because it was asking about examples of what you found in your report. So probably you can address to that. And I think the third one is more general. Would probably be open to any of the panelists who would want to give a intervention. So please, let's have Professor Annette go first, and then you can have Adam.
The issue that was raised about the problem that many African countries are now beginning to find themselves caught up in as a problem that emanates from the lack of understanding of the impact of signing double tax treaties or investment treaties without a proper policy understanding of where the country is going, and without coordinating those policies with other countries around us. And I think the trend of recent has been the need for ensuring more collaboration and coordination with other countries around us. Because the thing is that when these treaties are signed, they are not signed mainly for economic considerations alone. They are also political considerations. But when these political considerations are the tail that wags the whole body of the economics of the country, then it becomes a problem, and these issues begin to bite us later on. Because the treaties that we have signed are actually a contract between us and the different countries that we have signed the treaties with. So the problem we have had, first of all, is lack of understanding of how tax treaties, bilateral investment treaties work, and we only realize the implications of these years ahead. South Africa, for example, had to review its whole policy regarding bilateral investment agreements, the impact that the country had to face with respect to this. And of course, many countries in the West did not take it kindly. So you find a backtracking in many African countries, Nigeria, for example. You sign treaties, then you realize that you are suddenly going to lose this much of money when a specific case comes to light. And that's where the challenge is. I think there has been a recommendation. I don't need this now, right? I think there has been a recommendation for African countries and developing countries at large. Before we sign treaties, let us have a policy understanding of who we are. I think that's the problem that we have as Africa. Things are happening internationally. Sign this, go for this, get into this, and we just go with the flow without understanding how these things impact on our specific socio-economic circumstances. That is an imperative one. Uganda had to take a good move in this one and stopped further signing of treaties from 2014 until it has had a personal or in-depth understanding of who are we? What are we looking for? What is in it for us? Because the West, when they come to sign with us, they already know what they're up to. And the people that come to sign on the table, unfortunately, the majority won't have the understanding at the level that their fellow negotiators have come to. So we find that most of our treaties that we have got provisions in them that are more to the advantage of the developed countries than more towards us. So I think the problem we have, or the solution we have for this type of problem, is to ensure that we take a step back, think about who we are, think about our own specific circumstances, because they are different for each African countries. Some of us have taken a step ahead in the journey, and others are still lagging up behind. Others are way ahead and can negotiate at almost at par, the likes of South Africa, so to speak. So you cannot come up with the same recommendations that would work for South Africa for another country because of the political circumstances and economic circumstances we face. But in this regard, I think the politics is a big one. We need political will. We can sit here as technocrats, we can sit here as tax administrators, but if the politicians are not on board, it's a big problem. I will, as I come to an end, talk, for instance, about the multilateral instrument that is going to bring together base erosion, tax treaty-related base erosion provisions. Revenue authorities have been involved with this, but if a treaty is going to be signed, it has to be ratified by the committees that sit on Parliament. So we come as technocrats in revenue authorities to come and explain to them, and we've been in this process for years. We come to explain to them, and they have no clue what we are talking about. You need to bring them from the back. For example, in South Africa, just last May last year, after South Africa has signed up to this treaty, they come and discuss it with the committee that is supposed to follow up with ratification, and this person in the committee come and say, this is a sheer wastage of my time. I don't understand anything that you're talking about. So how is ratification going to take place? So we need a synergy so that we don't work in silos. Investment, revenue authorities, finance, and then a proper understanding exactly which ministry is better placed to deal with these particular issues. Because we have a loop-sided way whereby you have one ministry that really shouldn't be the strong one to make a final say on these issues, having a final say, and yet the one that we will have the final say on the matters when issues come to light, when cases rise up, is the last one to be dealt with, and then it has to come and begin cleaning up the dirt. So I think we have internal problems that we have to sweep our own houses and ensure that everything is in order.
Okay,
that is what I could say on that.
Thank you so much for that intervention. Yes, I think Adam will be the best to answer. Oh, yes, okay.
Okay, yeah. Okay, all right.
Yeah, I wanted to follow on what the professor has said, which I fully agree with all what she said. But I want to add, you know, we need to call this by its proper name. What is wrong in our contracts today is lack of transparency and corruption, blatant corruption. Most of our contracts are signed in secrecy, in places where nobody heard of them, and this is really the bottom of the or heart of the problem. If we do not address this through open contracts that is open to the public, and this is where I guess civic engagement, role of civil society organization to hold government accountable, particularly in major projects, they are signed, approved, implemented, nobody hear about this. This is extremely important, an issue of open contract. And since I'm having the mic moderator, I want to comment on two other things raised by Avi and the ambassador. Ambassador, I think you rightly mentioned why are multinational corporations working in Africa, and particularly in the extractive sector, are not listed in the stock exchange. If you look at one of the major findings of the high-level panel on illicit finance of Mbeki, they came up with this, and many other researchers, including our own, that 65% of illicit financial flows from this continent is linked to the work of multinationals. Again, secrecy. Illicit finance is money that is intended to disappear from the record of the source forever. Such companies will not have the transparency to go and list because nobody, there is no reporting of revenue or how much their expenditure and all this in a transparent stock exchange environment. That's why they are very happy to report their revenue in safe havens. Most of the multinationals working in the continent having their headquarters managed by one or two persons in safe havens. Yet 90% of their activities happen in this continent. They don't report it. I remember talking during the research on with the panel in Kenya. The president told President Mbeki and the team that we have companies here working with us for 15, 20 years, day in, day out. They report losses. They don't make any money. Yet they don't close shop. They continue operating. A company like this will never list in any stock exchange anywhere in the world, including in the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks to the lead speakers, commentators who really made comments that complement the work of the report, and in particular issues of whether we are rich or not rich ambassador. I think when we go to the interview, when you read the interviews we had collected, undertaken, and reported in this report, people feel that, especially in countries like Nigeria, Cameroon, the country is very rich in terms of natural resources, but they don't see these riches in their lives. So, but when you go to a country like Botswana, Botswana is an exception in this example of countries. The interviews show that people generally appreciate what government is doing. And I think this is an issue of governance. In Botswana, they have entrepreneurship programs that are directly linked to revenue generated from natural resources. And the revenue, they have plans also to use revenue to finance building of skills and investment, especially medium and small scale enterprises, and so on. And of course, in addition to building infrastructure and so on. So what makes, I think, what in chapter 5, we show how countries use natural resources in general to promote development, economic and social development, and to enhance their revenue in general, domestic revenue. And I think Botswana stands out because of governance. So governance is the main factor. In other countries, there are mixed results. If you go to a politician, a president or a minister in any country, Cameroon, Tanzania, Nigeria, or any of these countries, they will tell you that, no, we have made a lot of changes. We made good use of our resources to enhance growth and so on, and to fight poverty and so on and so on. But if you go to the general public, then they will tell you that we do not see this. However, the fact is in between. So these countries have made mixed progress based on their natural resources. We cannot deny the fact that Tanzania, Chad, for example, and many countries really benefited from their natural resource revenues. But I think more can be done. And for this to happen, governance, as all of you pointed out, is really the key factor. And then the institutional framework, the legal framework, and so on, also matter a lot for these countries to benefit from natural resources. So in short, in responding to your answer, I think Botswana provides the best example in Africa where a country made clear use of its natural resources to promote development. In other countries, the results are mixed. Thank you.
Maybe we can have 3 more comments, questions. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just would like to add to what the Professor and DS have just said in response to the question of the Honorable Delegate from Benin. And I want to say that one of the main problems that we also face in the issue of the contract is the fact that contract becomes governance instrument rather than being investment instrument that they are meant to be. And in many of the countries, the discussion will arise when there is a discovery of a field, rather than what we are proposing with the Africa Mining Vision, which is to say that the country first should have a vision on what he wants to do with its natural resource. And based on the vision, define a policy. And based on the policy, define the instrument, the legislation and regulation, and the instrument that will be used to reach that vision. So when you have that order, then when you are negotiating any contract at the country level, you have that in mind. And then you make sure that as the Africa Mining Vision is promoting, not looking only at the maximization of the financial benefit of the contract, but also the optimization of the development dividend from the contract. That's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that insightful intervention. Anybody else who would want to make a comment, a question? Do I see a hand? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, please.
Merci beaucoup. Je voulais juste...
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question with regard to what Madame said. The example of Chad, when they started exploiting their oil resources, the program that the country had put in place was very much supported by the World Bank, but then the head of state changed it. Now, what do you do if you have a president who changes the plan which is already in place?
I don't know. You want to? No. But anyway, let's have one more. We'll come back here. Yeah. Yeah. You want to respond quickly? Then you can just do quickly and.
Très rapidement, very quickly. I'm very proud to say that we at the African Mineral Development Center, we are the first who have just completed the first mining mineral policy of the government of Chad, the first ever in the history, and that happened in last August. So this is exactly what we are saying, that when there is no policy that has been agreed and discussed at the country level, it's very difficult to actually implement something very coherent. And I hope that from now on, Chad will have a better way to manage these resources.
Okay, yeah, that's what I wanted to ask, because what she was really asking is whether there is you can have a policy, you can have all these things, but the president can. How do you control a president who wants to change something? What do you do? I think we yes, please.
I think I want to quote Kojo here. No, don't get scared. What we normally refer to as a broad issue of the political economy of natural resource exploitation, it's a heavy loaded expression which masks under it many of these things, corruption included, state capture, erosion of trust between the leadership and the society, and all these things together provide for a suboptimal outcomes of investment. And I think in the final analysis, it points to one thing: prevalence of good governance in the country. Good governance is not about democracy, but about institutions, about country well governed and all that. And I guess when you don't have that, you might come up with this suboptimal kind of scenarios and outcomes. Botswana is a good case in point. I don't think we should just single out Chad. 80–90% of our countries are doing the same thing. The only good exception today is Botswana, and I think because of the good governance structure in the country. Many others. And I think this is a discussion, maybe you can take it on bilateral basis. Thank you.
Just wondering, how much time do we have now? It should be, yeah? We could start concluding, yeah. What I think, maybe just have each of the panel just make 1 minute something, just a reflection, and then you go ahead and conclude. So just say something, just one comment or something, just from what you have heard.
Well, clearly, I think this discussion has put the issue further up the agenda, on the African agenda, regarding the need for strong governance institutions and the link actually between structural transformation and how that itself is propelled by fundamental governance institutions that are effective, that are able to promote transparency and other forms of accountability in the context of mineral resource governance.
Thank you. I just wanted to give the example in Nigeria where the government had also invited key domestic foreign investors like Aliko Dangote into the downstream petroleum sector. And I think there's been an emphasis on the external nature of open contracts and negotiations, but internally and within Africa, we have enough investors that can also partake in this natural resource exploitation, and thereby the emphasis will be reduced. And as I said, we can look within. I think the solutions lie within, and when we lie within, we can actually improve our capacity, develop, take our steps gradually, and make sure at the end of the day we actually have good governance in this sector. Thank you.
Okay. Rabana Secretary, just one remark.
Thank you very much. I was just laughing here and saying that yes, the political economy with capital letters definitely is the elephant in the room. You know, I was just sitting here and saying to myself, Africa is entering the free trade zone area. And we'll have to do exactly what we are talking about now. We'll have to do that in the sense that are we going to export raw materials to each other in Africa? Or are we going to make sure that we have value addition, that we increase the industrial base in our countries in order to be able to trade amongst each other? So, what I'm saying is that coupled with the governance questions, etc., it should also enter the debate on the free trade area that we are talking about. That's one. But I also agree with Ambassador. Ambassador, you talked about smart partnerships. I am talking about strategic partnerships. I don't think that as Africans, we have really thought about what is our vision, what is it that we want to do with our resources on our continent before we enter into partnerships, be it with China, be it with Turkey, with whoever else. I think that always remains my worry, because if we are not clear about what we want to do with our resources at the end of the day, then surely history will judge us, and may judge us very harshly. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor, just quick, because the interpreters really have to leave. Just please make it very brief.
I'm going to make it quick. Just to say that, okay, we have lots of problems, political problems in Africa, but there is a bit of good news. At least from South Africa, we've been having a lot of issues, like in the last administration, but this is the public domain, so I can speak about it. You can Google it. We have fortunately had some strong institutions that have been able to deal with issues relating to transparency. For example, we have had the tax ombudsman that had to literally review issues relating to the Commission of South African Revenue Services on VAT refunds and all sorts of things. And right now, the transparency and the strength of that institution has resulted in the previous Commission of SARS being taken for disciplinary action. So it is possible, I don't know to what length in African countries, but this is a ray of hope that at least something has been done in South Africa in that light. So don't give up too soon. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll now call upon Mr. Adam Areka to give closing remarks and we finish. Close the session.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm very happy that to see this launch happening after the interruption we had at the beginning. And a lot of people came here and we asked them to wait, and then some of them went and came back. And I would like to thank you for coming back again for the launch. I would like to particularly thank Madame Gowanis, Under Secretary General, for joining us. I was pleasantly surprised that you are sitting here, because I thought you will not be here. I would like also to thank Ambassador Bakoli for his excellent remark. And I would like to thank also Professor Annette of the University of South Africa, who joined us all through from the inception of this report and the review, and she is with us here today. My colleague Koju Busia. And Mr. Chair, thank you. And I would like to thank my colleagues who contributed to this report as well as the organization of this launch. I think we are being pressured to walk out of this room. There is another meeting in this room. So we are going to have another roundtable, side event in conference room 3 on the priorities for tackling illicit financial flows in Africa. And you are immediately after this one, right away. So you are all invited. Thank you.
Yeah,